Story 1: The Painting. Blackwater Ridge, Montana. The cabin had been in Ellen Marsh's family for 30 years, and she had been coming to it since she was 4 years old, which meant she knew it the way you know a place that has been part of every version of yourself. She knew the way the second bedroom door swelled in humidity and had to be shouldered open. She knew the particular sound the porch made in a west wind, a low moan through the gap between the railing and the floor that her father had called the cabin breathing, and that she had found comforting as a child in a way she had never found comforting anywhere else. She knew the smell of it, pine resin and old wood, and the particular mineral quality of the well water that she had never smelled anywhere else in 34 years of smelling things in the world. She knew this cabin. This was important. This was the foundation of everything that followed. Ellen Marsh knew this cabin the way she knew her own hands, and when something in it was wrong, she was not going to miss it. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in late September, alone for the first time. Previous trips had always been with family or with her husband David before the divorce, but this trip was hers alone, and she had planned it specifically as an act of reclamation. 4 days in the place that had been hers before it had been anyone else's and would be hers after. She drove the 2 hours from Missoula, turned off the main highway onto the forest road, drove the 7 miles of gravel to the pull-off, and carried her bags the 1/4 mile to the cabin door. Everything was as it always was. The key under the third porch board from the left, the same place it had been for 30 years. The main room with the stone fireplace and the kitchen along the back wall and the 2 bedrooms on either side. The porch with the gap in the railing. The smell. The silence, arriving immediately and completely the moment she closed the door behind her, the way a familiar song arrives when the first note plays. She moved through the cabin the way she always moved through it on arrival, checking the familiar things. The water pressure from the kitchen tap, the propane connection on the stove. The firewood stacked on the left side of the porch, which her cousin had restocked in August based on the family agreement about maintenance. Everything was in order. She came back into the main room, and she looked at the wall above the fireplace. The painting was wrong. The painting above the fireplace was a landscape, Montana mountains, done in oils in a style that was realistic without being photographic, painted by Ellen's grandmother in the late 1970s, and hung above the fireplace before Ellen was born. She had looked at it her entire life. She knew it the way she knew the cabin, completely and below conscious thought, in the way that things you have seen thousands of times become part of your baseline reality. The painting was wrong. Not damaged, not moved, not replaced with something else. The same painting, the same frame, the same mountains and the same arrangement with the same sky above them and the same tree line along the bottom edge. But in the lower right corner of the painting, in the trees at the right edge of the tree line, there was a figure. Ellen crossed the room and stood in front of the painting and looked at it. She had not looked at it with this kind of attention in years, perhaps decades, because you do not look with attention at something you have seen thousands of times. You see it the way you see the furniture, as a given. But she was looking at it now, and she was certain, with the certainty of someone who has looked at something her entire life, that the figure in the lower right corner of the trees had not always been there. It was small, proportional to the landscape, a person seen from a distance, standing in the tree line at the right edge of the painting, standing and facing outward, facing the room. She took it down from the wall. She carried it to the kitchen table where the light was better, and she held it and she examined it. The figure was painted in the same style as the rest of the painting. The same brushwork, the same palette, the same aging of the paint surface. It was not a recent addition. The paint over the figure had the same crackle pattern as the rest of the painting, the fine network of tiny fissures that oil paint develops over decades. If it had been added recently, the paint over the figure would be smooth and new. It had always been there. Ellen had simply never seen it. She hung the painting back above the fireplace. She made dinner and she ate it, and she told herself that she had never looked at the painting carefully, and that the figure was something her grandmother had painted into the tree line as a detail, and that she was only now noticing it, and this was interesting rather than disturbing, and she was going to have 4 good days in this cabin. She went to bed at 10. She lay in the darkness of the main bedroom, and she listened to the cabin breathing, and she slept. She woke at 2:40 in the morning to a sound from the main room. The sound was specific, and she identified it immediately despite being pulled from sleep by it. It was the sound of the fireplace. Not a fire. There was no fire. She had not lit one. It was the sound the stone fireplace made when the temperature differential between the warm interior and the cold exterior night was significant enough to produce a movement of air through the flue, a low susurration that she had heard before in this cabin, a sound she knew. But underneath, that sound was something else. A sound that was not the fireplace, and was not the porch, and was not the wind, and was not anything she had categorized in 30 years of knowing this cabin's sounds. It was a very soft sound, almost at the threshold of hearing, that she would have described if pressed as the sound of something moving across the wooden floor of the main room. Careful movement, weight being placed with deliberateness. She lay still, she listened. The sound continued for approximately 30 seconds and then stopped. She lay in the silence for a long time. The cabin breathed, nothing else. She got up. She went to the bedroom door and she opened it and she looked into the main room. The main room was dark, lit only by the ambient moonlight through the 2 front windows, and it was empty. The furniture was where it was. The kitchen was where it was. The stone fireplace was where it was, dark and cold. The painting above the fireplace was where it was. Ellen stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at the painting in the moonlight. At this distance, and in this light, she could not see the detail of the tree line. She could see the shape of the mountains and the pale suggestion of the sky and the dark mass of the tree line along the bottom, but the figure in the lower right corner was too small and the light too dim to resolve it. She went back to bed. She did not sleep again until morning. In the morning, she went to the painting. She stood in front of it in the good morning light that came through the east window, and she looked at the lower right corner where the figure stood in the trees. The figure was facing a different direction. She stood in front of the painting and she breathed and she looked at it with every rational faculty she had. The figure was in the same position in the painting, same location in the lower right tree line, same scale, same brushwork, same crackle in the paint surface. But the orientation of it had changed. It had been facing outward, facing the room, when she had examined it the previous afternoon. This morning it was in 3/4 profile, turned to the left, as if it had been facing the room and had begun to turn away. Ellen Marsh was a woman who had spent 20 years as a restoration conservator for an art museum in Missoula. She knew oil paintings. She knew what they could and could not do. She knew the chemistry of linseed oil and pigment and the physics of a paint surface that had been drying and crackling for 40 years. She knew what was and was not possible with a painting of this age and composition. What she was looking at was not possible. She photographed the painting. She photographed the lower right corner specifically, close up, from multiple angles in the morning light. She sent the photographs to her phone's cloud backup. Then she looked at the photographs on her phone and compared them to what she was looking at on the wall, and they matched. The figure in 3/4 profile, turned to the left, in the photographs the same as in the painting. She called her cousin Robert, who was the family member most recently at the cabin and who had been there in August. She asked him about the painting. She described the figure in the lower right corner and asked if he had noticed it. Robert said he had never noticed any figure in the painting and asked why she was asking. She said she was asking because she was looking at it and wanted to know if she was seeing something that had always been there. Robert said he honestly couldn't remember ever looking at the painting carefully and asked if everything was okay. She said yes and got off the phone. She spent the day outside. She hiked the ridge trail above the cabin and she sat at the top and looked at the mountains and she thought about the painting and about what she knew and did not know. What she knew. The figure had been there long enough for the paint above it to have the same crackle pattern as the surrounding surface, which meant it was not a recent addition. What she did not know why she had never seen it before, and why it appeared to have changed orientation. What she could not reconcile, that a 40-year-old oil painting with undisturbed crackle throughout the painted surface had changed. She came back to the cabin at 4 and she stood in front of the painting and she looked at the figure, 3/4 profile, facing left. She noted the orientation specifically. She got out her phone and she took a photograph and she noted the time on the photograph, 4:17 p.m. She made dinner. She ate. She sat by the fire she'd built and she read, and at 9:30 she put the book down and she went to the painting and she looked at it. The figure was facing the room again. Not 3/4 profile, not in the position it had been at 4:17. Full forward, facing outward, facing the room the way it had been facing the room when she first noticed it on Friday afternoon. Ellen stood in front of the painting for a long time. The fire was behind her, and it cast her shadow on the painting, and the figure in the lower right corner was in the shadow, and she stood there, and she understood that she had two choices. She could take the painting down and put it face first against the wall in the second bedroom and not look at it again for the remainder of her stay. Or she could leave. She took the painting down. She carried it to the second bedroom. She put it face first against the wall in the corner. She went back to the main room and she stood in front of the empty space above the fireplace where it had hung, and she felt the specific wrongness of an absence that should have felt like relief and did not. She went to bed. She woke at 3:11 to a sound from the second bedroom. The sound of the second bedroom door opening. The particular sound of a door that had to be shouldered past the swollen frame, the resistance and the release, a sound she had known her entire life, a sound she was therefore certain of. The second bedroom door, which she had closed behind her when she put the painting in it, opened. And then she heard footsteps in the main room. Not on the wood floor exactly. Just beside the edge of hearing, the suggestion of movement between the second bedroom and the main room, the sense of something crossing a space with the careful deliberateness she had heard the night before. And then silence. Ellen lay in her bed with her eyes open, and she did not move. She lay there until morning, full morning, light under the bedroom door, birds in the trees outside the window. Then she got up. The painting was back above the fireplace. She had put it face first against the wall in the second bedroom. She had not touched it after that. She had not left her bed after the footsteps. The painting was above the fireplace, hung straight and level the way it had always hung. She stood in front of it and she looked at the lower right corner. The figure was gone. The tree line in the lower right corner was empty. Trees, sky, mountains, the way her grandmother had painted them, the way she had always known the painting to look, the way it had looked before Friday afternoon. No figure in the trees, no small shape facing the room. Empty tree line. Ellen Marsh packed her bags in 20 minutes. She drove the 1/4 mile with her bags because she was not making 2 trips. She drove the 7 miles of gravel to the highway, and she drove the 2 hours to Missoula, and she did not stop. She has not gone back to the cabin. The painting is still above the fireplace. She knows this because her cousin Robert went up in October and called her and asked about the painting because he had looked at it this time, and there was something in the lower right corner he hadn't noticed before. A figure in the trees. Facing the room. Robert said it looked like it was waving. Ellen told him to take the painting down. She did not tell him what to do after that. She does not know what to do after that. Story 2, The Name on the Wall. Hatchet Creek, Tennessee. The cabin was a rental. Marcus Webb had found it on a platform he used occasionally for weekend trips, a well-reviewed listing with good photographs and a host named Gary who had been on the platform for 3 years and had 42 reviews and a 4.9 rating. The listing described a 1-bedroom cabin on a creek in the eastern Tennessee mountains, remote but accessible, a 15-minute drive from the nearest town. Sleeps 2, fully equipped kitchen, fire pit on the creek bank. No Wi-Fi, which was the point. Marcus was 38 and he was a writer. Not a successful one yet, not in the way that paid for things, but working toward it in the serious and unromantic way of someone who had decided that the working was what mattered and had arranged their life around the working. He had a day job that paid for everything else, and he wrote in the mornings before the day job, and in the evenings after it, and on weekends, and he had been doing this for 6 years, and had one novel in a drawer and another one he was currently destroying and rebuilding simultaneously. He had come to the Tennessee mountains for 4 days alone to rebuild it. He arrived on a Thursday evening, and the cabin was exactly as photographed. He liked it immediately. The sound of the creek through the open window, the bare wood walls, the simplicity of the single main room with the kitchen at one end and the fireplace at the other, and the table in the center where he set up his laptop and his notebooks and his coffee setup. He liked the bedroom, small and dark and suitable for sleep. He liked the outhouse path that went 20 feet into the trees, which he did not like but could tolerate. He liked the fire pit on the creek bank and the sound the creek made, which was constant and varied, and which he thought he could write inside of. He made dinner, he read for an hour, he went to bed at 10. He woke at 6 and made coffee and sat at the table and opened the notebook and wrote for 3 hours without stopping, which was the best 3 hours he had experienced in months. He ate lunch. He walked the creek for an hour. He came back and wrote for another 2 hours. He made dinner and sat at the fire pit and watched the creek in the last of the light and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the novel was going to be what he needed it to be. He went to bed satisfied and slept without interruption and woke at 6 and made coffee and sat at the table. And saw the writing on the wall. It was on the wall to the left of the fireplace. The cabin walls were bare wood, horizontal planks of aged pine, and the wall to the left of the fireplace was the wall Marcus faced when he sat at the table, which meant he had been facing it for 5 hours the previous day and had not seen what was on it. He was certain of this. He had sat at the table facing that wall and he had not seen it. What was on the wall was writing, not carved, not burned, written in what appeared to be charcoal or pencil or something similarly dark and smudging, in letters that ranged from 2 to 4 inches in height, filling a section of the wall approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, positioned at a height that would be about chest level for a standing adult. Marcus crossed the room and stood in front of it and read it. It was a list of names. Not a list in any organized sense. Names written at different angles, some horizontal, some slightly tilted, some written over other names, the whole thing dense and accumulated the way writing gets when someone has been adding to it over a long period of time. Male names and female names, first names only, some he recognized as names and some that seemed like names but were unfamiliar. He counted what he could distinguish. He stopped at 40. There were at least 40 names on the wall of this cabin. He stood back and looked at the wall and he thought about what he was looking at. His first thought was that this was a guest tradition, that the rental cabin had a tradition of guests writing their names on this wall, and that Gary, the host, either did not know about it or knew about it, and considered it charming, and had simply not mentioned it in the listing. This was a completely reasonable explanation. He held it and examined it. The names were not written in the same hand. He could see this when he looked at the section closely. The letters were different sizes, different styles, different pressures. The way writing is different when different people have written it. Multiple hands, many people over what appeared to be some span of time. But there was no marker. No pen, no charcoal, no pencil stub left near the wall the way there would be if the tradition was ongoing, and the implement was accessible to guests. Marcus looked along the wall and on the mantel and on the kitchen counter and found nothing that could have been used to write on the wall. He looked at the names again. He took photographs with his phone. He went back to the table and he opened his laptop and he looked at the listing photographs and he looked at the photograph of the interior that showed the wall to the left of the fireplace, and the wall in the photograph was bare. No names, no writing. The listing photographs could have been taken before the names accumulated, which was not a useful data point because he did not know when the photographs had been taken. He messaged Gary through the platform. He described the names on the wall and asked about them. He sent a photograph. He asked if this was a guest tradition. He sent the message and he went back to his notebook and he wrote, and he did not hear back from Gary that day. He heard back from Gary the following morning. Gary's message said, "I'm not sure what you're referring to. That wall was bare when I was last at the property in July. Are you certain you aren't describing something you brought with you?" Marcus looked at this message for a long time. Then he went to the wall and he looked at the names. Then he took more photographs in better light. He sent the photographs to Gary and said he was certain he had not written 40 names on a wall with an implement he could not find in a cabin he had arrived at alone 2 days ago. Gary did not respond to this message. Marcus spent the day trying to identify the names, not in any systematic way. He sat at the table facing the wall and he looked at the names, and he wrote some of them in his notebook and he thought about them. He was a writer, and this was the kind of thing a writer's mind did with unexplained material, which was try to make a story out of it. Here was the story his mind made. This cabin or this land had something associated with it, something that had caused people to write their names on this wall, not as a tradition, not as a charming guest gesture, as something else, as a record, as something closer to what people do when they want proof they were somewhere, real proof, not a review on a platform, but a name on a wall in handwriting that is theirs and cannot be disputed. As something closer to what people do when they are not certain they will be able to say they were there. He did not like this story. He put his notebook face down and he went outside and he walked the creek for a long time. He came back to the cabin at 4 in the afternoon, and he stood in the doorway and he looked at the wall from across the room, and he looked at the names in the afternoon light, and he saw something he had not seen in the morning light or the photograph light, which was that the names were not all written in dark material. Some of them, underneath the legible names in the wood itself, were scratched. Not written. Scratched. As if someone had used a fingernail or something similarly fine and hard, and had scratched letters into the pine plank with enough pressure to leave a mark in the wood grain that was only visible in the low-angle afternoon light that came through the west window and raked across the surface of the wall. He crossed the room and he crouched in front of the wall and he looked at the scratched names. He counted them in the raking light. There were more scratched names than written ones. He stood up. He looked at the wall. He thought about the difference between writing a name with an implement you brought to the wall and scratching a name with something you had available when the implement was not an option. He thought about what that difference implied about the circumstances under which the scratched names had been made. That night he locked the cabin door with the deadbolt that was on it, and he did not go out to the outhouse when he woke at 2 in the morning because he was not going to unlock the deadbolt. He lay in bed and he listened to the creek, which was constant and varied, and he thought about the names. In the morning, he saw that a new name had been written on the wall. Below the dense section of accumulated names, below all of them, in the same dark material as the existing written names, in the space of bare wall beneath the main cluster, a single name. Marcus. His name. Written on the wall of the cabin while he slept. He left within the hour. He drove the 15 minutes to the nearest town, and he went to the gas station, and he sat in the parking lot, and he filed a report with the county sheriff's department, which sent a deputy to the cabin that afternoon. The deputy called him and told him the cabin was empty and locked as Marcus had left it, and that the wall had the writing on it as Marcus had described. The deputy asked Marcus if he had written his own name on the wall. Marcus said no. The deputy said he'd follow up with the property owner. Marcus drove back to Nashville. He has not heard from Gary. The platform removed the listing 3 weeks after Marcus filed a complaint with them. He does not know why they removed it. He thinks about the scratched names sometimes, about what it means when an implement is not available, about what it means when you use what you have. He has not been able to write since he came back from Tennessee. He does not know if that will change. He is not sure he wants it to. Story 3, The Door at the End. Redfall, Oregon. The road to the cabin ended a 1/4 mile before the cabin did. This was in the listing, described as a short walk through old-growth forest on a maintained path, and Diane Collier had known about it when she booked and had considered it a feature rather than a flaw because she was 51 years old and had hiked her entire adult life, and a quarter-mile walk through old-growth Douglas fir was not a hardship but a pleasure. What the listing had not described, and what Diane would later consider the relevant omission, was what the cabin looked like from the path as you came out of the trees. What it looked like was a cabin that had been built by someone who understood isolation in a way that went beyond the merely remote. It sat in a clearing that the forest had made and was making back slowly. The trees at the clearings edged closer than they should have been based on the cabin's apparent age, the undergrowth between the tree trunks thick and impenetrable looking. The cabin itself was well maintained, newer than the land around it, with a metal roof and sealed windows and a solid door with a good lock. But it sat in the clearing, the way something sits when the world around it has decided to close in. Diane noticed this and filed it as atmospheric and continued up the path. The host had left a note on the kitchen table. His name was Paul, and his note was thorough and warm, describing the water system and the propane and the hiking trails and the surrounding forest and the nearest emergency services, which were 40 minutes away. He had left a binder with additional information and a local map and a list of wildlife she might encounter, which included black bear and cougar, which was information that she had expected and was prepared for. At the bottom of the note, after the information about wildlife and emergency services, Paul had written one additional thing. He had written, "The door at the end of the hall is a storage closet. The lock sticks. I apologize, I've been meaning to fix it. Please don't try to force it." Diane read this and looked up from the note at the hallway, which ran from the main room to the bedroom at the far end. She could see the bedroom door open. She could see, between the main room and the bedroom, another door on the left side of the hallway, closed. She had not noticed it when she carried her bags to the bedroom on arrival. She put Paul's note in the binder and she went to the hallway and she looked at the door on the left side. It was a plain door, same wood as the rest of the cabin interior, with a simple knob and a keyhole below the knob. She tried the knob. It turned, but the door did not open, which was consistent with Paul's note about the stuck lock. She left it and went about the business of settling in. That first night was perfect. Diane Collier was a person who knew exactly what she wanted from a solo cabin stay, and she had arranged all of it efficiently. She made the dinner she had planned, and she sat on the small porch, and she looked at the clearing and the forest beyond it in the last of the late September light, and she felt the deep settling that she had come for. She went to bed at 9:30, and she slept without interruption until 6, and she woke feeling more rested than she had felt in months. She spent the day hiking. She found the trail that Paul's note had described, which ran east from the clearing into the old growth, and climbed a ridge that looked down over the Umpqua River Valley. And she was on top of the ridge by 10 in the morning eating an apple and looking at the valley and thinking about nothing in particular, which was the whole point. She came back to the cabin at 2. She made lunch. She sat at the table with a book and she read for 2 hours, and at 4 she put the book down and she went to make tea and she stopped in the hallway. The door at the end of the hall was open. Not the bedroom door. The storage closet door that Paul's note had said was stuck. It was open. Not fully, perhaps 8 inches, enough to see darkness beyond it. Diane stood in the hallway and looked at the open door, and she thought about the stuck lock that Paul had apologized for, and about the fact that she had tried the knob the previous afternoon and the door had not opened. She went to the door. She pushed it open fully. It was not a storage closet. It was a staircase. Wooden stairs, narrow, going down. A basement or a subfloor level below the cabin. The stairs descended into darkness that the daylight from the open door did not fully penetrate. There was a smell from below, cold and mineral, the smell of a below-ground space that had been closed for some time. Diane stood at the top of the stairs and she looked down into the dark and she thought about Paul's note. The door at the end of the hall is a storage closet. She thought about the deliberateness of that description. Storage closet. She thought about the apology for the stuck lock. "I apologize. I've been meaning to fix it." She thought about what you say in a host's note when you want a guest to not open a door, and she thought about what you don't say. She did not go down the stairs. She closed the door and she tried the knob. The knob turned and the door opened easily, the lock not sticking at all. She closed it again and went to the kitchen and she made tea and she called Paul's number, which was in the binder. Paul answered on the third ring. She described the open door and the staircase. There was a pause. Then Paul said it was not a storage closet. He apologized for the note. It was a basement that he used for equipment storage, and the door should have been locked, and he was sorry it hadn't been. He said the basement had nothing in it of interest, and that the stairs were steep, and he preferred guests not go down them for liability reasons. He said he would arrange to have the lock fixed. Diane asked him when he had last been at the cabin. Paul said 3 weeks ago. She asked him how the door had come to be open. He said he must have left it unlatched when he was last there, and it had worked itself open. She said the door opens inward. She said it would need to be pushed, not pulled, to open from the hallway side. She said a door that opens inward does not work itself open by working free of a latch. She said she was describing the physics. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said he didn't know what to tell her and that he was sorry for the confusion and that she should feel free to lock the door herself. She asked him if there was a lock on the inside of the door, meaning the staircase side, meaning the basement side. He said he didn't think so. She asked him if he was certain. He said he wasn't certain. She thanked him and hung up. Diane was not a woman who frightened easily. She had hiked solo for 30 years, had camped alone in grizzly country in Wyoming, had navigated a winter storm in the Wind River Range by herself at the age of 43. She had a practical and physical relationship with risk that did not include the category of haunted basements or mysterious staircases. She dealt in real things, in weather and terrain and navigation, and what she was dealing with now was a real thing. A door in a cabin that had been described as a storage closet and was not. A host who had said the lock was stuck and a lock that was not stuck. A staircase going down into a darkness that someone had been in recently enough to open the door from. She took stock of what she had. She was 40 minutes from emergency services. She had no cell service beyond the ability to call Paul, which she had used. She had a solid lock on the front door and window latches on the 2 windows. She had no vehicle at the cabin. Her car was parked at the trailhead a 1/4 mile away. She went to the door and she looked at it from the hallway side, the knob and the keyhole. She went to the binder and she went through every page until she found, paperclip to the back cover, 2 keys on a ring with a tag that said spare. She took the keys to the door and she tried them. The second key fit the keyhole and the lock engaged. She locked the door. She put the keys in her jacket pocket. She made dinner. She ate it at the table facing the hallway and the locked door at the end of it. She built a fire. She read for an hour, and at 9:15 she got up and went to the hallway and looked at the locked door. There was light under it. Not much. A thin line of light under the door at floor level from below, faint and steady. The light of something that was on in the space below the cabin. She had not turned on a light below the cabin. She had not been below the cabin. The stairs had gone down into darkness when the door was open, and there had been nothing on when she locked the door. Something below the cabin had turned on a light. Diane Collier went to the front door of the cabin, and she unlocked it, and she put her headlamp on, and she walked the 1/4 mile through the old-growth forest to the trailhead in the dark, and she got in her car, and she drove to the nearest town, which took 40 minutes, and she checked into the only motel, and she sat on the motel bed, and she called 911 and reported that there was someone in the basement of a rental cabin at the address Paul's listing had given. The county sheriff's department sent 2 deputies to the cabin. They called her at 1 in the morning. They told her they had found the cabin as she described it, locked front door, light visible under the hallway door. They told her they had unlocked the door and gone down the stairs. They told her there was a room at the bottom of the stairs. A large room, finished, not the equipment storage Paul had described. A room that appeared to have been occupied regularly. There was a cot. There was a portable lamp, battery-powered, which was on and which was the source of the light under the door. There was a folding chair. There was a shelf with food supplies. There was a small battery-powered heater. There was a second door in the room, at the far end, that opened to a tunnel, a crawl space or a manually dug passage, that the deputies had traced to an exit point in the tree line at the east edge of the clearing. A passage from the forest into the room below the cabin, into the room below where Diane had slept the night before. Paul, the host, was reached that night by the sheriff's department. Paul told them he had no knowledge of the room or the passage, and that he had owned the property for 2 years and had purchased it from an estate sale and had never investigated the basement thoroughly. Paul was investigated. The investigation is ongoing. The platform has suspended his listing. The passage from the tree line to the room below the cabin is estimated to have been in use for a significant period of time, based on the wear on the tunnel walls and floor and the accumulation of supplies in the room. The batteries in the portable lamp were fresh. The food on the shelf had recent purchase dates. Someone had been using that passage. Someone had come up the stairs and opened the door that Paul's note said was a storage closet and stuck. Someone had been in the hallway of the cabin. Diane does not know for how long. She does not know if she was asleep when the door was open or awake. She does not know if the first night, the perfect night when she slept without interruption until 6 and woke more rested than she had been in months, she does not know what was in the room below her while she slept. She does not go to rental cabins anymore. She does not walk quarter-mile paths through old-growth forest to reach a clearing that the trees are slowly taking back. She does not sit on small porches and look at forest edges in the last of the September light. She reads Paul's note sometimes. She has it in the binder which she took with her when she left. She reads the line about the storage closet and the stuck lock and the apology, and she thinks about how a note like that works. About what you put in a note when you need a guest to make a specific decision, and you need it to seem like practical information rather than a warning. About what it means when someone who knows what is below a cabin wants you to not go below the cabin. She thinks about the light under the door. About what kind of person turns on a light in a basement they are hiding in. What kind of person makes themselves visible? And why? She has not found an answer. She does not expect she will.